This is the fastest reincarnation I've ever seen. Two girls were robbed by a knife-wielding assailant. To save the girls, the male protagonist lunged forward, sending the assailant flying. However, he unfortunately collided with the assailant's knife. He was instantly transported to another world. He had just woken up when a young mother gave him a facial cleansing. The male lead was stunned to find himself a child. He was completely dumbfounded. He accepted the fact that he had been reborn. And the first thing he did was check if his, you-know-what, was still there. The maid thought he had wet his pants. After feeding him, she kindly patted his back to help the male lead relieve his bloating. She directly slapped him, and he stood up immediately. Soon, the male lead was 2.5 years old. He was born into a noble family. His father also took 2 wives. The first wife had 2 sons. The second wife, who is the male lead's mother, also had an older sister. Then, upon hearing that this world had magic, the male lead immediately became excited. After 2.5 weeks of study, the male lead quickly learned the world's language. Then, after studying magic from a spellbook for 2.5 hours, the male lead made his first attempt at using magic. Then the male lead made a second attempt. Sure enough, he's a blind idiot. In the following time, the male lead also learned that this world has many races, so he looked forward to having a harem in the future. Then the male lead also turned 5 years old. And in this world, everyone at the age of 5 will go to the church to receive the god's baptism. On the way to the church, his sister told him that after the baptism, he would have a status panel. Although his sister's stats were average, she had a strange attribute: she liked him the most. The male lead quickly tried to change the subject. After arriving at the church, the archbishop immediately began the baptism ceremony. But the originally ordinary ceremony became extraordinary when it came to the male lead. Because after the archbishop finished the lines, the gods actually, damn it, appeared. It turned out the male lead was directly summoned to the god realm by the gods. After the 7 gods introduced themselves, the goddess in charge of reincarnation told the male lead that his death was actually not expected by them. Because even if the male lead hadn't intervened, the 2 girls wouldn't have been in danger. According to the setup, the robber would have tripped while running towards the girls, and then been subdued by the surrounding crowd. But in the end, the male lead still died because of his good deeds. So, the Earth's gods asked them to reincarnate the male protagonist into this world. And when the god of magic learned that the male protagonist started practicing magic at 2.5 years old, he greatly admired him and decided to bestow a blessing upon him. At this time, the other gods couldn't stand it anymore and scrambled to give the male protagonist buffs. It can't be that, right? After the gods stacked all the buffs on the protagonist, the deity sent the protagonist back, making such a big commotion. The father was also eager to know what kind of attributes the protagonist had gained. But the protagonist remembered what happened just before leaving. The god's malicious smile. He quickly used a poop technique to escape the scene. After diving into the cabinet, the male protagonist opened his status panel and was stunned. He never expected that the god had directly maxed out all of his attributes to level 10. You should know that the highest level for an ordinary person is only level 5, and he was now twice as powerful as that. No wonder the gods would laugh so wickedly. If others saw this, they'd be scared to death. At this time, the male lead suddenly discovered that he had a disguise attribute skill. So the male lead immediately used the skill to modify his ability values. Because he didn't know what the average ability values of ordinary people were. Even with the modified attributes, it still startled his father. To prevent the protagonist from being captured for research, his father quickly instructed others to keep the matter secret from him. Back in his room, the protagonist saw another book on summoning magic creatures. So, the protagonist, who loved fluffy animals, couldn't wait to go outside and try the summoning spell, but no fluffy animals appeared. Instead, an ugly demon appeared. The older and younger sisters quickly rushed over to offer their lives. After defeating the demon, the male protagonist collapsed as well. Thinking the male protagonist was dead, the 2 sisters started crying. But after just 2.5 tears fell, the male lead suddenly came back to life. After all, he had the protection of 7 gods. How could he die so easily? The next day, at the male lead's birthday ceremony, because he was the 3rd son of the family, he wasn't qualified to inherit the family business. His father asked him what he wanted to do in the future. He said he wanted to see a wider world, meeting all kinds of people. At just 5.5 years old, he already has 2 harem members. His mastery of magic has reached a peak level. He can casually unleash incredibly powerful magic. A 2.5 boulder can be completely obliterated in an instant. And it's not just magic. In terms of physical combat, even adults seem like toddlers in front of him. He makes them look like they're only 2.5 years old. The reason he's so amazing is because he received the full blessings of 7 gods. Since the protagonist's dream is to become an adventurer, his father decided to hire 2 tutors for him. After the protagonist waited for 2.5 hours, the maid told him that the tutors had arrived. Feeling excited, the protagonist immediately teleported outside the window. After leading the 2 teachers into the room, the red-haired one is called Genie, the green-haired one is called Taimei. Both of them are D-rank adventurers. Then the 2 of them brought the male protagonist to the training ground to begin training. The first thing they trained was swordsmanship. But as soon as the male protagonist made his move, Genie was shocked. Taimei also felt that the male lead's swordsmanship even surpassed Genie's. So Genie, to prove herself, decided to have a mock battle with the male lead. However, after only a couple of exchanges, Genie also sensed that the male lead's strength was extraordinary. Taimei also said there was no problem, just as she was about to teach the male lead some basic magic, but the male lead said he'd learned all this from books long ago. Then he demonstrated it to Taimei. Now both teachers were speechless. He could cast all attribute magic, and that's not all. The power was incredibly immense. Most importantly, the male lead was even casting without incantations. You should know that just shortening the incantation time, it would take 20.5 years of practice. But the main character is only 5.5 years old. The 2 teachers also felt that there was nothing more they could teach him. Seeing the 2 of them sweating profusely, the main character quickly pulled out a towel from a prop box. But this shocked the teachers even more. They never expected that he even possessed the rare skill of having a prop box. The house is about to be torn apart by the male protagonist if he continues to practice on the training ground. The 2 teachers had no choice but to ask the male protagonist's father to let him go to outside world for training. After hearing the reason, the parents couldn't help but be overjoyed. In order to keep the family, the father had no choice but to agree to the 2 of them. But the condition is that they must come back before dark. Then the 2 teachers took the male lead out of the city. After arriving at an open space, Taimei asked the male lead to try using intermediate magic. Taimei was speechless, because the power completely exceeded the range of intermediate magic. More importantly, the male lead didn't feel tired at all after releasing such awesome magic. This shows that the male lead still has an enormous amount of mana. At this moment, the 2 teachers suddenly noticed something. Then a killer rabbit suddenly charged out of the bushes. Seeing that 2 adults weren't easy to mess with, the killer rabbit turned and charged at the male lead. The killer rabbit never figured out until he died why this kid was so awesome. Because this was the first monster the male lead killed, he put it into his prop box planning to show it off to his parents. Seeing the male lead's item box, Genie was filled with envy. She decided to save up and buy a magic bag too. Although a magic bag isn't as amazing as the male lead's item box, but it also has the effect of storage. It's just a bit expensive. With 2.5 hours left before sunset, the 2 of them decided to train the male lead. So, Taimei cast a scouting spell to check the positions of the nearby monsters. It was the male lead's first time seeing such magic, so he curiously asked about how to use it. After learning the method, the male protagonist tried to release them. Unexpectedly, he succeeded immediately. Hearing the male protagonist's accurate count, Taimei was also extremely surprised. Just as the male protagonist was about to chase, Genie and Taimei stopped him. Because there were many ferocious beasts in that forest, and every 2.5 years, they will gather for the hunt. If that happens, the monsters inside will flood out and attack the town. That's why the walls are built so strong. I mean, isn't that dragon stupid? It has wings, but it still comes here to ram the walls. After saying all that, it was getting dark. They could only go back as planned. That night, the main character discovered he had only killed a few rabbits, but his level had risen to 8. Afterward, the male lead translated the system interface into Japanese. He discovered that it was all because of a skill of a divine apostle. It could increase the experience gain rate by 100 times. The male lead almost died of fright. If this were discovered by the government, he would definitely be captured for research. The next day, because the male protagonist is too amazing, ordinary monsters are no match for him at all. The 2 teachers brought the male protagonist to the Adventurers Guild to gather information on monsters that could serve as worthy opponents for him. But before they could find any information, the 2 teachers were targeted by a rooster-headed man. Just as Genie was about to leave with the male protagonist, she was captured by Coxcomb Head and his companions. They planned to forcefully take them there for a drink or two. Just when Coxcomb Head was about to mouth one first, the male protagonist grabbed Coxcomb Head's arm. Then he aimed a hand knife at the Coxcomb Head. Coxcomb Head didn't expect the child is so strong. The angry Coxcomb Head immediately responded with an attack. He punched the male lead, but the male lead dodged. The Coxcomb Head ended up doing a split on the spot. The Coxcomb Head guy had never been treated like that before. Taimei hugged the male lead. She expressed her gratitude to him. Genie also praised him, saying he was amazing. Thus, under the shocked gaze of the two teachers, the male protagonist continued practicing for another 2.5 years. The contract with the two teachers was soon about to expire. One day, while the male protagonist was tidying up his room, the maid told him that his two teachers had refused to extend their contract. They said there was nothing more they could teach him. The male protagonist was very understanding about this. After all, as adventurers, they can't stay by his side forever. So, he decided to prepare a gift for the two teachers. Remembering Ginny once said she wanted a magic bag, that night he teleported to the forest to select materials suitable for making magic bags for the teachers. But he didn't know I had already caused a great disaster. After collecting the materials, he transmitted them back home. But he left his handkerchief behind. When the father arrived at the scene with his men, they only saw a huge, deep pit. His men were completely confused. Just as the father was about to reprimand his men for false reporting, he suddenly noticed the handkerchief on the ground. He immediately understood what was going on. Back home, the father immediately took a handkerchief and started to reprimand the male lead. Seeing his father sighing incessantly, the male lead could only keep apologizing. The next day, under the supervision of the two teachers, the male lead completed his last day of training. Today, they were about to say goodbye to the male lead. Though the two teachers were incredibly reluctant, they still told the male lead that he had graduated. And the male lead took out the magic bag he had made last night and gave it to them as a gift. Genie was completely convinced. You know, these two monsters were even a challenge for A-rank adventurers. It's a being that can only be barely killed by teaming up. But considering the male lead's performance over the past 2.5 years, the two weren't that surprised. The male lead also reassured them. Although the materials used were a bit exaggerated, it's just a common magic backpack. Its capacity is barely enough to hold their house. But Ginny was even more surprised. The magic bag that Ginny and the others wanted to buy the most could only fit into a carriage. And even such a small one, she needs to save for 2.5 years to afford it. So this level of magic bag is completely a national treasure. To thank the male lead, they both knelt down before him. This little brat is so awesome. Even a casual fireball is like a meteor hitting the earth-level magic by an unbelievably awesome dragon. He can easily kill it with a casual sword strike. At the age of 8, he earned the title of Dragon Slayer. And at 10, he started a harem. Even the king is vying to marry his daughter to him. Of course, the king did this. Besides recognizing the male lead's strength, there was a more important reason. The story begins 2.5 hours earlier. Because as a noble, at the age of 10, he had to go to the capital to attend the debutante ball. The male lead's family then took a carriage to the capital. However, halfway there, the male lead, using his perception magic, detected someone being attacked by a monster 2.5 li ahead. His father nearly got a fright. He hadn't expected the male lead to be able to sense something so far away. Before his father could recover, the male lead jumped straight off the carriage. In just 2.5 seconds, the male lead arrived at the scene. He saw a group of half-orcs attacking a carriage. Without hesitation, the male lead took action. The guards didn't expect the male lead to be so powerful. But what was even more amazing was yet to come. In just a few moves, the male lead took down most of the half-orcs. But in the end, the male protagonist still neglected. He let a few fish that slipped through the net get close to the carriage. Because he is afraid that using magic will accidentally injure friendly troops, the male protagonist decisively took out an iron sword. 2.5 swords were used to kill 2 small ones. Then he chopped down the last big one with a blazing knife. Here comes a very pretentious ending. After seeing all the monsters solved, the guards collapsed, weakened. Seeing this, the male protagonist quickly used a group healing spell to heal the injured guards. Powerful magic instantly restored their strength. Then, the male protagonist put the bodies of the fallen guards into item boxes. And his father rushed over. He saw the gruesome scene. The father understood why the male lead was so anxious. Then the father suddenly recognized the Grand Duke's insignia on the carriage. Just as the father was questioning the guards, the carriage door opened, and the person inside was the Princess Her Highness and the Grand Duke's daughter. The father quickly led the male lead in paying their respects to them and introduced the male lead to the two of them. The two princesses were just about to express their gratitude when the blonde-haired one suddenly fainted from fright. Seeing this, the male lead quickly used his magic to calm them down. The powerful magic instantly sent the two princesses into ecstasy. After regaining consciousness, the blonde-haired one immediately threw herself onto the male lead. The blue-haired one wasn't to be outdone. She grabbed the male lead's hand. She expressed her admiration for him. She called the male lead coach and said she wants to learn magic too. Upon learning that the male lead was also going to the capital, the two princesses lifted the male lead, under their father's dumbfounded gaze, and forcibly took him onto their carriage. Watching the carriage speed away, father was completely dumbfounded. Similarly, the male lead in the carriage was also convinced. Clearly, the carriage was quite spacious, but the two insisted on clinging to him. The male lead originally wanted to sit opposite them, but was pulled back by the blonde-haired princess, all to get closer to the male lead. Blonde-haired told the male lead to call her by her nickname, Genie, from now on. Blue-haired wasn't to be outdone. She told the male lead to call her Time. The male lead was so excited he almost burst into song and dance. But under their forceful pressure, the male lead eventually gave in. Just as the male lead was struggling to decide, a guard interrupted them and told that they were about to reach the next town. The two princesses quickly suggested resting there for the night. After arriving at the inn, the male lead was about to take his leave, but the two princesses quickly stopped him. Because of what had just happened, they were still a little afraid, so they hoped he would protect them for one night. Of course, their father disagreed. Although the male lead is only 10 years old, it's still inappropriate for an unmarried man and women to share a room. But the two princesses are still afraid that monsters will attack them at night. The male lead is really at a loss. What the hell kind of monsters are in this city? But the two princesses insist on sleeping with him. The male lead can only helplessly agree. But the condition is that the room must be large and they must sleep in separate beds. Seeing how happy they both are, laughing like that, the male lead immediately has a bad feeling. When it was time to sleep, since both of them wanted to sleep next to the male lead, they placed him in the middle. But the scheming Time wanted to get even closer to him. Genie, of course, wasn't satisfied. She also pushed the bed towards the male lead. She forcibly turned the single bed into a double bed. The male lead was truly speechless. He had hoped to maintain some distance from the two of them, but unexpectedly, they became even bolder. They expressed fear of being attacked by monsters at night, and wanted to sleep hugging the male lead. The next day, the male lead, sporting dark circles under his eyes, boarded the carriage. After all, given what happened last night, how could he possibly have slept? Thus, after 2.5 sleepless nights, the group finally arrived at the capital. Upon arriving at the palace, the leader of the knights greeted them, but the two princesses still clung to the male lead's arm, refusing to let go. He was really exasperated. Then, the male lead handed over the bodies of the fallen guards to the knight's leader, and intended to meet up with his father, but the leader grabbed him. He said the king wanted a special audience with him. The protagonist arrived at the palace, and all the nobles in the palace were waiting for him. After arriving before the king, the minister first announced the protagonist's achievements to the nobles. Then the king thanked him for saving his daughter. He directly ennobled the protagonist as a baron and bestowed upon him 10 gold coins and a mansion. As soon as these words were spoken, a murmur immediately arose amongst the audience. A fat nobleman immediately objected. After all, being ennobled at the age of 10 was unprecedented. But the king's decision was not something a minor nobleman could influence. After receiving a few rebukes, the fat man quickly and shamefacedly withdrew. Then the king's expression changed. He kindly asked the protagonist if he would accept the title of nobility. The protagonist could only accept helplessly. Seeing this, the king declared the audience at an end. But the king didn't intend to let the protagonist leave just yet. He then summoned the protagonist and his father to the reception room. Then, as a father, he sincerely expressed his gratitude to the protagonist. The main character and his father were also surprised and honored. But what surprised them even more was yet to come. Because the king and the duke actually both wanted to marry their daughters to the main character. This wasn't a rash decision, but one made after careful consideration. It turned out that 2.5 hours ago, after hearing from their daughters just how amazing the main character was, they decided to do whatever it took to keep him in the kingdom. So he shamelessly brought up old grievances, trying to use morality to force the male lead into a marriage contract. The male lead was helpless, so he could only cast a pleading look at his father. It was all because he received full blessings from 7 gods when he was reborn. He becomes the strongest human at the mere age of 10. Not only did the king eagerly bestow titles and honors upon him, but even 2 princesses vied for his hand in marriage. That day, 7 gods found the male lead. Because this world lacked entertainment, so they hoped he could use his past life's knowledge to create some entertainment items. For the male lead, a person from Earth, this was naturally a piece of cake. After returning, the male lead immediately found a prop shop and wanted to ask them to make a board game. After hearing the game plan, the boss also found it very interesting. He decisively accepted the commission. The male lead also took out a gold coin as payment for the sample. The boss was almost scared to death because it was just so much. But the male lead wasn't short on money at all. He considered the extra part as an upfront investment. The boss gratefully accepted it. It was only when he was about to leave that the male lead remembered he had forgotten his sister. It turns out he had sneaked away while accompanying his sister to buy clothes. Seeing his sister's angry face, the male lead quickly started flattering her. Although he immediately managed to calm her down, his sister still wanted him to make up for what he had missed earlier. And so, the male lead was dragged by his sister to see her trying on new clothes again. After a 2.5-hour costume show, the maid came to him, telling the male lead that someone was looking for him. It turned out that the prop shop owner had worked day and night to make the chessboard. After seeing the sample, the male lead was very satisfied. Then, after the male lead demonstrated the gameplay to the owner also thought it would definitely be a big hit. The male lead immediately suggested that he mass-produce it. He was already planning to do so, but he decided to make a deluxe version and a standard version to sell them to nobles and commoners respectively. Then he instructed the boss to make 50 sets of the deluxe version first, and 1,000 sets of the standard version. But the boss was troubled after hearing this, because he simply didn't have that much capital. Just as he was calculating how many silver coins he needed, the male lead directly took out 5 gold coins and slapped them on the table. This almost scared the boss to death again. He hurriedly stated that he would do his best. After the funding issue was resolved, it was time to apply for a patent from the gods. As long as they offered this product to the god of commerce, no one else could replicate it for 3 years. Then the two placed their hands on the board and chanted an incantation. Accompanied by a flash of golden light, the board disappeared from the table. Then the male lead asked the shopkeeper again to make a super luxurious version of the board to give to the king. Hearing that it was for a royal offering, the shopkeeper was nearly scared to death again. At the same time, he couldn't help but admire the male lead even more. But the male lead thought it was nothing. If he knew that even the gods were playing the reversal chess he made in heaven, he would probably be scared to death. 2.5 days later, the nobles' appearance meeting officially began. After arriving at the venue, the male lead also noticed the previously ennobled, the fat one. His 3 little brats attended the debut. But the male lead didn't pay them any attention. Instead, he went to Tai Mei. Watching the two greet each other, his father-in-law also showed a strange smile. The male lead was speechless. Because our last meeting was in a private setting, both sets of parents launched into a very formal self-introduction. Then, the male lead looked at his fiancée in her formal dress, and couldn't stop praising her. His father was truly amazed. Even a 10-year-old is better at charming girls than he is. The male lead quickly explained that he learned all this from his older sister. Because he always make her angry, he could only say more flattering words to cheer her up. Then the king made a grand entrance with the princess. After the king finished his speech, he called the male lead over again. The male lead hurriedly took out the chessboard to distract everyone. Although the king was also interested, he was still more concerned about his daughter. So he asked the male protagonist to come and talk to him after the banquet. The male lead is also speechless. Although his father feels proud of having such an outstanding son, he still hopes the male lead can be more like a child, and chat with people his own age more. After saying this, Dad left with Mom. The male lead also feels like he might have gone too far. After all, which child at the age of 10 is already granted a title and doing business? At this point, Tai Mei finds the male lead. She wants to have a private chat with him. The two of them then sit on the sofa and start showing off their affection. Since Tai Mei always refers to herself as the adult, it makes the male lead feel a bit uncomfortable. So he tells her to just call him by his name instead. Just then, 3 little brats came running over, smelling the dog food. The leader, after praising Tai Mei a couple of times, started fantasizing about Tai Mei throwing herself at him. But clearly, he was thinking too much. Tai Mei only returned a polite greeting, so the little brother wasn't happy. He immediately wanted to go out and compete with the male lead. The male lead, of course, wasn't intimidated. However, after a few of them went outside, Tai Mei still wouldn't let go of the male lead. Where the hell is this magic coming from? At this point, another little guy couldn't take it anymore. He immediately went for round 2. By the way, is your magic hidden in your crotch or something? After gathering his magic from his pants, the little brother unleashed his long-accumulated earth magic. Seeing the little brother wanting to go for a 3rd round, Tammy could no longer take it. She directly interrupted the little brother's spellcasting and informed the 3 of the male lead's title and how he had defeated 30 half-orcs. The 3 of them had, of course, heard of the male lead's reputation. Tai Mei also knew the male lead was deliberately acting surprised. So she used this incident to threaten him into going on a date with her. Xiangzi, on the other hand, decided to tell Genie about it. Conveniently, Genie came running over at that moment. She saw Tai Mei about to speak. The male lead quickly covered her mouth. Hearing this, the male lead quickly let go. Tai Mei then boasted about the male lead agreeing to a date with her. Genie instantly became jealous. Then, she used the earlier mouth-covering incident as a threat, to get the male lead to go on a date with her too. The male lead was helpless. He had no choice but to agree to Genie's request. But those words were overheard by Genie's father. "That kid is amazing. At only 10 years old, he already owns assets worth over $1 billion. And he married 2 princesses, reaching the pinnacle of life. He casually displays a Warcraft specimen at home, a red dragon of cataclysmic level, let alone how valuable it is. Just the terrifying exterior alone would startle every visitor. And that casually installed smart toilet with its bidet function was also a favorite of everyone. Even the king used it and said it was great. After all, a happy bottom is the best." That day, the protagonist arrived at the mansion gifted by the king. It had been unoccupied for a long time. The house was dilapidated. A casual wipe revealed 2.5 grams of dust. So the male lead decisively cast his architectural cleaning magic. Just 2.5 seconds, the house was instantly renewed. I have to say, magic is really convenient. It even repairs furniture. Soon, the maid and butler his father arranged for him arrived. The butler's name sounds a little unsafe. After the maid assigned everyone their tasks, everyone went to clean. But unfortunately, the male lead had already cleaned everything with magic. There wasn't a speck of dust in the room. The maid wasn't surprised at all. After all, she had watched him grow up. But the butler was different. Soon, the male lead's family came over for a visit. What a sight! After touring all the rooms, the father gave him some advice. He thought that, as a noble, the male lead should display some artwork at home to elevate the ambience. So, the male lead decisively brought out the dragon specimen. Now, it's not just the maid, but even his dad almost died of fright on the spot. He thought the protagonist had stolen it from some museum. The male lead quickly explained that he had defeated it 2.5 years ago, by chance, in the forest. His dad was even more surprised after hearing that. After all, this was a natural disaster-level monster. Even a whole battalion of soldiers might not be able to handle it. But considering the male lead has the full-level protection of 7 gods, his father quickly came to terms with it. Upon hearing that the red dragon was worth a staggering 1,100 gold pieces, the male lead also did the conversion in his mind, and was surprised to find it amounted to 100 billion yen. Then, his mother's surprised exclamation suddenly came. Rushing over, he found his mother staring blankly at the toilet. Then, father told the protagonist that nobles who own mansions must traditionally hold an unveiling party, inviting other nobles to visit their homes. The protagonist was really speechless, but he still followed father's instructions and had the butler prepare some invitations. The protagonist had originally wanted to invite the king as well, but the butler said that only families of the rank of count or above in the royal family were allowed to receive them, so the male lead had no choice but to give up. Then the male lead made some glass goblets, because people in this world only have earthenware, so the male lead decided to use these as gifts for the guests. Next were the drinks and dishes for the reception. The dish was hamburger patties. The maid took a small bite and found it very good, and the drink was sparkling wine. The maid had never tasted such wonderful wine. She was immediately conquered by its delicate bubbles. Because the male lead is underage and can't drink alcohol, he asked the maid to describe its taste. But the maid wanted to drink more, so she lied, claiming she needed another drink to be sure. As a result, she accidentally drank 3 bottles. The male lead was speechless. Now, without her saying anything, he knew how delicious the wine was. At this time, the butler told the male lead that the king wanted to see him. The king summoned the male lead because of the debutante ball. All the nobles received invitations except for him, his father-in-law. The male lead is really impressed, but luckily, he had guessed the king's intentions long ago. So he had the butler prepare invitations in advance. The king was overjoyed at the sight. But hearing that the king was coming to visit, the maids were terrified. Fortunately, the head maid was already used to it. Under her comfort, everyone quickly calmed down. 2.5 days later, the debut event officially began. Taimei attended the event with her father. Although her father had heard about it beforehand, he was still shocked when he saw the red dragon. However, Taimei was very happy. After all, this will be their home from now on. Seeing that most people had arrived, the male lead also raised a glass of water to toast everyone. As expected, it was the first time for most to taste sparkling wine, and they were absolutely delighted. And these beautiful glasses, it was the first time they had ever seen them. Hearing that he could bring some back, the father-in-law was overjoyed, and the dishes the male lead prepared were also excellent. At this time, the king also rushed over with the princess. Seeing the king, the nobles were also shocked. They didn't expect the male lead to have such influence. He actually made an exception and had the king come to attend his small nobles' banquet. The king, unsurprisingly, went through the motions. He was conquered by the hero's wine and food. The princess was also very satisfied with her future husband's culinary skills. At this time, the queen, having finished using the restroom, found the male lead. She wanted the male lead to install the same type of toilet in the palace. The king became curious after hearing this. After experiencing the posterior cleansing, the king was very angry. There is such a good thing, but the male protagonist doesn't tell him. After ordering the male protagonist to install this kind of toilet for him immediately, he praised the hero in front of all the nobles and let them learn how to treat guests from the male protagonist. At this time, the old bastard who came late finally arrived. Relying on his title to be higher than the male protagonist, facing the hero's welcome, he opened his mouth and spat out a load of nonsense, mocking the protagonist's house as small as a dog kennel. So the protagonist directly pulled the butler who wanted to remind him, and the fat noble, who had just entered the door, was startled by the red dragon placed at the entrance. However, the fat noble, who had received a blow, remained unrepentant, and continued to mock the protagonist's poor taste. He also claimed that the guests he invited were all insignificant nobles. Everyone showed their disgust towards him. Sure enough, flies are annoying wherever they go. Then, after the fat noble finished tasting the sparkling wine, although he was quite shocked inside, he said it tasted bad. The same went for the hamburger steak. The male lead really wanted to kill this noisy guy on the spot, but he couldn't just lose his temper. So he had the butler bring a gift, hoping to quickly get rid of this idiot. But this old geezer got even more arrogant. Seeing such exquisite wine glasses, he directly asked the male lead to bring him 50 more. The male lead decisively refused. But after sensing the king's approach, the male lead said he would give him an even greater gift. Hearing this, the fat noble was even more excited. But he never expected the greater gift the male lead spoke of was actually the king himself. The fat noble immediately cowered. After being scolded by the king, the old scoundrel quickly knelt and left the protagonist's house. At this time, Time also came over. She also saw that the protagonist had deliberately set up this old noble. Afterwards, the protagonist also received a scolding from the king. The protagonist originally wanted to argue, but he had only spoken 2.5 sentences before he couldn't help but burst out laughing. This kid is incredibly awesome. It's all because he received the god's max level blessings during reincarnation. At only 10 years old, he became the strongest human on earth. Taking on a whole night order by himself is like a piece of cake to him. Even the supposedly strongest sword saint is no match for him. But what's troubling the main character is after the sword saint was defeated, she shamelessly insists on marrying him. This, of course, didn't come without scolding from his other 2 fiancées, but the 2 quickly accepted reality. After all, the male lead is incredibly impressive. Even more absurdly, after learning how impressive the male lead is, the king also made a decision that goes against his ancestors. Just now, the male lead found the vice commander of the knights. Because the king also wants to make a specimen of the warcraft, he asked him to help find a place to store the warcraft's body. So the deputy commander casually found a warehouse. But the main character thought it was too small. The deputy commander was startled. He thought the main character had brought his red dragon from home. The main character said it wasn't that bad. But there was one earth dragon. The vice commander almost died of fright when he heard that. You know, even if their entire knight order went into action, they wouldn't necessarily be able to defeat it. So the vice commander had no choice but to have the male protagonist keep the magical beasts on the training ground first. However, after the male protagonist brought out all the magical beasts, the vice commander was completely dumbfounded. He didn't expect that, in addition to the earth dragons, there would be a whole bunch of even more powerful monsters. Looking at the piles of monster corpses, the vice captain couldn't help but begin to question the protagonist's true identity. He wondered whether he's a hero or an apostle of the gods. The protagonist was also startled. He quickly came up with some excuse to brush it off, then prepared to make a quick exit. But the vice captain pulled him back. He wanted him to train with the knights. He also wanted the captain to meet the male lead. The male lead could only helplessly agree. After arriving at the training ground, the vice captain first introduced the male lead to the knights. But hearing that he had to spar with a child, one knight immediately refused. He didn't want to be labeled a bully. So the vice captain played a trick. He let him go first to spar with the male lead. Out of chivalry, the knight also decided to let the male lead have the first move. After witnessing the male lead's strength, all the knights became less courteous. However, just as they were about to besiege the male lead, the squadron leader descended from the sky and stopped them. The unaware squadron leader first scolded the soldiers, then comforted the male lead in her arms. Mistaking the besieged male lead for someone who must have been quite frightened, she then scolded the second in command. The second in command was speechless. He simply told her the male lead's identity. Hearing that the male lead was the one who single-handedly defeated 30 half-orcs, that amazing kid, the captain immediately perked up. She immediately wanted a showdown with the male lead. The male lead was speechless. The supposed simulation battle suddenly turned into a duel. Seeing their sword saint captain about to bully a child, the 8 soldiers retreated while also muttering their complaints. Everyone thought the male lead was definitely going to lose. Seeing the male lead actually fight the captain on equal terms, everyone showed expressions of disbelief. But what surprised them even more was their captain was actually defeated by a child. After the captain was defeated, she decided to marry the male lead. The male lead decisively refused. He is only 10 years old, and the age difference between them is too big. But the team leader said that age is not a problem, because their elf race has an average lifespan of 300 years. So their appearance will remain young after adulthood. Even when the male lead grows up, nothing will change. The male lead quickly said that this kind of lifelong matter he cannot decide alone. He need to discuss this with others. After saying this, he looked at the vice commander for help. But the vice commander feigned sleep to avoid the issue. The commander, however, thought the male lead's suggestion was reasonable. He couldn't decide this matter based solely on his own wishes. So she decided to let the king decide their marriage. The male lead nearly fainted upon hearing this. If the king knew he had a princess and was still womanizing, wouldn't he be doomed? But before he could refuse, the male lead was forcibly dragged away and brought before the king. Then the captain told the king about their marriage. The king and the father were both startled. The male lead quickly explained the whole story to them. Because his engagement to the princess was something the king asked him to keep secret, the male lead did not tell the captain about it. The father was also helpless. Then he told the male lead that the captain's identity was actually quite complicated. Although the elf tribe is part of this country, politically, it is almost like an independent nation. And the captain is actually the princess of this elf kingdom. In other words, the male lead has once again been proposed to by a princess. The king has no objections to this. However, the captain needs to know that the male lead is already betrothed to his daughter and the duke's daughter. But this also indirectly shows that the male lead is someone even the king and duke approve of. The captain, after hearing this, became even more excited, eager to marry the male lead right then and there. The king and the old man also began to have headaches. They could only helplessly agree. However, the commander first needed to get her father's permission. The commander was thrilled. She immediately dragged the male lead to write a letter. After they left, the king couldn't help but start doubting the male lead's identity. After all, he was only 10 years old. He could defeat the squad leader, the country's peak in combat power. The vice squad leader also mentioned that when he asked whether he was a hero or an apostle of the gods, the protagonist's expression was very unusual. The strategist suggested there might be a way to test it. The method was to use the legendary Imperial-grade magic book. One day, the protagonist, looking exhausted, was wandering around when the vice squad leader approached him. Seeing the male lead in this state, the vice captain is also curious about what the male lead has been going through lately. The male lead tells him that he and the captain have been dating every day using duels, and the captain exhausts him completely every day before letting him go. So, being tired is inevitable, and after spending a few days accompanying her in training, the male lead also inexplicably gained the title of Sword Saint. Then, he suddenly heard the captain calling him. He was just about to run away, but the vice captain grabbed him. Then he was forcibly brought before the king. Seeing everyone gathered, he thought he had committed another mistake, but the king simply handed him a magic book. This is said to have been written by the first king. The male lead was also incredibly excited, because the most he'd encountered before was super magic. He'd never seen emperor-level magic before. Seeing that the male lead could understand it, the king also realized something. The text on it was something they couldn't understand. The male lead finally reacted. He didn't expect this book to be written in Japanese. No wonder the king couldn't understand the characters on it. The male lead didn't expect this either, that the first king was also a transmigrator, just like him. So, under the king's intense questioning, the male lead had no choice but to admit that he was a reincarnator. He said he had memories of his past life, just like the first king, from a country called Japan. This was undoubtedly a bombshell for everyone else, especially for the male lead's father. He couldn't help but question whether the male lead was really his child. The male lead said there's no doubt about it, because when he was baptized at the age of 5, the divine being said so as well. This nearly scared the king and the others to death, especially after learning that the male lead had met all 7 gods. The king's reaction was even stronger. At the same time, they were also very curious about what kind of abilities this male lead actually possessed. The male lead had no choice but to open his panel for them to see. Everyone almost got scared to death again, because the male lead's panel was simply too exaggerated. Not only does he have the title of Divine Apostle, but he also has the full 10-level divine protection. You know, ordinary people at most only have level 5, and at most they can only obtain 1 type. So, before his title of Divine Apostle, let alone the king, everyone in the world must kneel before the male protagonist. But this life of being revered by all, it's not what the male lead wants. Because his biggest dream is to become an adventurer, so he hopes they will help him keep this secret. Although the king agreed, he made a surprising decision. When Jeannie and Taimei learned that the male lead and the captain were engaged, they were completely shocked. To this, the male lead could only repeatedly apologize. At only 12 years old, he was already engaged to 3 princesses. The elder elf sister even pestered him daily, wanting to marry the male lead immediately. Even when he read a book, 2 princesses would be clinging to him, competing to have a sweet date with him. Hearing their jealous bickering, the male lead finally couldn't take it anymore. So he escaped, using the excuse that he had other things to do today. However, he had only just breathed a sigh of relief after leaving when the squadron leader found him again. He wanted to drag the male lead outside the capital to participate in a simulated battle. The male lead decisively refused, because he truly did have something to do today. Then the male lead changed into an adventurer's outfit. He then arrived at the Adventurers Guild. It turned out that today he had turned 12. He could officially register as an adventurer. While filling out the forms, he chose not to mention his title of Baron, preferring to keep a low profile. After completing the forms and registering his magical power, the male lead officially became an adventurer. Although he has to start from the lowest G rank, he is very happy. Just as he was thanking the receptionist, a young man suddenly approached, along with 2 companions, to harass the receptionist. Seeing this cliched scenario again, the male lead was simply speechless. Why do I keep running into this kind of thing? And the little guy didn't even bother pretending, he just kicked the male lead. Then a redhead came and broke them up. Because the redhead is quite famous in the Adventurers Guild, the little guy didn't dare to mess with him. He just took off. The male lead also thanked him. The red-haired man saw that the male lead had considerable strength, so he decided to have a drink with the male lead and make friends. Of course, the male lead was drinking juice. The reason why the little guy was so afraid of him earlier was because the red-haired man was a Class A adventurer. Seeing his glittering business card, the male lead was extremely envious. But the red-haired man told him that it wasn't really anything special, because above him, there are S-level and SS-level cards, and even a triple S black card. At this moment, Redhair's wife suddenly showed up. Seeing that Redhair was leisurely drinking, his wife immediately gave him a smack on the head. Then, she grabbed his ear and dragged him out to complete a mission. The protagonist was speechless. After bidding farewell to Redhair, the male lead has also decided to take on a quest. But due to level restrictions, the only quest he can take is to hunt goblins. However, the male lead is still very happy. Just as he accepted the quest and walked out the door, the guild leader approached him. Then, the guild leader pulled him into a hug. It turns out their night order planned to have special training outside the royal capital. Unexpectedly, she ran into the male lead here. After learning that the male lead planned to hunt goblins outside the city, the captain decisively assigned the special training task to the vice captain, intending to accompany her husband on the mission, ignoring the vice captain's miserable expression. The captain grabbed the male lead who was about to slip away, and dragged him towards the city gates. Soon, the captain pulled the protagonist into the forest. The protagonist, using his perception magic, quickly located the goblins. However, when they arrived, they found the goblins bullying a farmer. After quickly teleporting and driving off the goblins, the protagonist used magic to heal the farmer's wounds. Meanwhile, the captain drew his sword and charged at the goblins. Then he quickly and easily dealt with them. But then more goblins rushed out. The protagonist decisively cast a strengthening spell. Then he shot the goblin leader. Just then, a group of lizard men charged out. So the protagonist told the leader to retreat with the farmers. He stayed behind to deal with the lizard men. After the male lead left, the adventurers who came looking for the lizard monster only saw a deep pit. And these 2 adventurers were the male lead's teachers. But the male lead didn't know that. After returning to the guild, the male lead reported defeating a group of lizards. He told the older sister about the strange things that happened. The older sister was also shocked after hearing it. Then she immediately reported it to the supervisor. So the supervisor called the male protagonist over, because he suspected the male protagonist had used a proxy player. After all, he only registered as a G-rank adventurer today. What's more, he's just a child. How could he possibly defeat a C-rank monster? Only adventurers can defeat the lizard monster. Although the older sister strongly defended the male protagonist, the foreman still believed he was right, because he'd seen too many commoners like the male protagonist who cheated to get a reward. He'd seen far too many, so he decided to revoke the male protagonist's guild card and expel him from the guild. At that moment, the guild master walked in. The foreman quickly played the villain and reported first. He revealed the male lead's cheating. But the president didn't believe it at all, because he had recognized the male lead. However, the president didn't directly expose it. Instead, he called the leader outside to come in. At that moment, the president also told the foreman about the male lead's noble title. But what shocked him even more was yet to come. Upon learning that the male lead was the hero who defeated 30 half-orcs, rescued 2 princesses, and whose father was a count, the foreman was terrified. But that's not all. Because the team leader is the chairman's sister, the male lead is her brother-in-law. Showing disrespect to him is showing disrespect to his superior. The foreman didn't expect the male lead to be so formidable. He hurriedly knelt down before the male lead and apologized. Seeing his sincerity, the male lead generously forgave him. At the same time, because the male lead completed the sea level mission, the chairman decided to upgrade his rank to sea level. But the captain thought it wasn't enough. After all, her husband defeated the red dragon when he was only 10 years old. What's more, the male lead is even stronger than she is. After hearing this, the president also decided to make an exception. He directly promoted the male lead to Class A. The supervisor and the older sister didn't dare to object. They quickly went out to process the paperwork for the male lead. After they left, the guild leader also apologized to the male lead for his subordinate's rudeness. Originally, when he heard that his younger sister was going to marry a child, he was a little uneasy. But after meeting the male lead in person today, he felt relieved. So he entrusted his younger sister's life to the male lead. Meanwhile, 7 gods were also watching the male lead. The god of magic saw the male lead causing a commotion again. They also think they've made the male lead too overpowered. But the creator god thinks it's not enough. The male lead needs to be even more overpowered. Because the demon king's seal is about to be broken. The gods were shocked when they heard this. After realizing the severity of the situation, they decided to find a teacher for the male lead to rapidly improve his strength. But the male lead doesn't know any of this. Because he happens to be free today, he decides to spend some quality time with the 2 princesses. This makes Genie and Taime overjoyed. Wow, this kid is amazing. He casually conjures a basic fireball spell, with the power of a nuclear bomb. He almost demolished the school. Then look at the fireballs of his peers. The weaker ones aren't even as powerful as his farts. And during the swordsmanship test, he only used 1/10 of his strength, yet he fought the examiner on equal footing. He completely dumbfounded his classmates. The others had never seen such an amazing peer. And because the 2 princesses cling to him every day, the male lead also became the target of jealousy from all the other male classmates. Although the girls liked the male lead, with 2 fiancés constantly watching from the side, he often got punished by them with kneeling. Being a man under strict control at such a young age, the male lead felt quite helpless. One day, while the male lead was sleeping soundly, the maid suddenly rushed in. So today's the male lead's entrance exam. The maid almost forgot. If it were because of her negligence and he couldn't go to school, she would blame herself for the rest of her life. But just as the maid was blaming herself, the male lead reassured her. Then he ran around the corner. He used a teleportation spell to instantly transport himself to the school. Although he made it to the exam on time, he didn't know that he had teleported to the commoner's exam location. After arriving at the written exam hall, the other students all looked worried and frustrated while looking at the exam questions. Only the male lead looked relaxed, because he had his past life's memories. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were a piece of cake for him. In just 2.5 minutes, he finished all the questions. Then he lay on the desk and prepared to sleep. The examiner was helpless. After the written examination, next was the magic exam. And the method was very simple. Because this training ground is equipped with a defensive barrier, the examinees only need to use their strongest magic to hit the target. Then the first examinee began to chant an incantation, and a fireball hit the target. Following that was the second examinee. Seeing their pathetically weak power, the male protagonist realized the gap between himself and his peers. If he uses his strongest magic, he'll probably destroy the entire school. Soon, it's the male protagonist's turn to test. He can only use the most basic fireball spell to deal with it. The male protagonist is really impressed. He never expected this so-called defensive barrier to be so fragile. The examiner is also stunned. It's simply because she'd never seen such an amazing fireball spell. But more important than that, was confirming whether anyone outside the walls was injured. So the 2 examiners had no choice but to end the magic test early and let the students proceed to the swordsmanship test. And the swordsmanship test was quite simple. Just spar with these adventurers and let them give their assessment. And the red-haired man from the last episode was among them. Upon seeing the male lead, the red-haired man volunteered to be his opponent. Before the male lead could refuse, the examiner accepted on his behalf. The male lead was helpless. Seeing the male lead raise his sword, the red-haired man urged him to use his full strength. The male lead thought, since the redhead is an A-rank adventurer, he must have some skill. So he activated his body enhancement and charged at the redhead. After sensing the male lead's power, the redhead also instantly became interested. But this was tough on the other examinees, because their movements were too fast for them to see clearly. Seeing that the male lead could actually fight him on equal terms, at this time, the examiner couldn't stand it anymore. He directly stopped the two of them, because this level of simulated battle would make other examinees fearful of the exam. The redhead also felt that he had gone too far. So he gave the male protagonist a perfect score. The examiner was also extremely angry. He scolded the male protagonist. The male lead could only bow his head and apologize repeatedly. Seeing the red-haired man's nonchalant expression, acting as if nothing had happened, almost drove the male lead crazy. The next day, the king directly found the male lead, the self-respecting divine apostle. It turned out that the commotion he caused during the exam had already reached the king's ears. He said that it was only the most basic magic. If he used super tier or emperor tier magic, the school probably wouldn't exist anymore. Hearing that the male lead had even learned emperor tier magic, the king was somewhat disbelieving. So the male lead wanted to give them a demonstration on the spot. The king and the others were almost scared to death. They hurriedly stopped him. But compared to all that, the king is more concerned about how the male lead ended up in the commoners' exam hall. It turns out the academy is divided into a south gate and a north gate. Commoners enter through the south, nobles through the north. In other words, the male lead went to the wrong gate. Because they didn't see the male lead, the two princesses were also quite angry, and Jeannie's father had also been put in a difficult position. It turns out the principal reported this to him yesterday. He said that a commoner not only aced the written exam but also scored full marks. It even destroyed the training grounds. It was even a draw with an A-rank adventurer. So they didn't know how to announce his results. When the Duke heard this, he immediately guessed that it was the male protagonist. After all, only the male protagonist could do something this ridiculous. So he told the headmaster to announce it honestly. But when he thought about the chancellor's reaction to the repair costs, he couldn't help but laugh. The chancellor was indeed quite troubled, but he still had to pay this sum of money for the male lead. After all, the king was his father-in-law. The king had no choice either. After scolding the male lead in the hall, he told him to leave. After the results were announced, the male lead, as expected, got a tied rank for first place in the school. And the male lead's sister also attended this academy. The male lead's sister was overjoyed. After all, she hadn't seen him for a full 2.5 months. Meanwhile, the maid was also restless at home. Seeing the male lead return, she quickly asked about his exam results. Hearing that he had gotten first place, the maid finally felt relieved. She immediately decided to prepare 100 servings of dinner to pamper the male lead. The male lead was really speechless. He was completely being treated like a pig. The day of the entrance ceremony soon arrived. The male lead's father and mother also attended the ceremony. Just as he was greeting them, Jeannie and Taimei came over. They saw the male lead in uniform. The two princesses were completely captivated by him. However, his affectionate actions with the two princesses aroused the jealousy of all the male students. But the female students felt differently. And the male lead, as the top student, was also supposed to give a speech on behalf of the freshmen. After he finished his speech, the king suddenly walked onto the stage. Because the male lead was incredibly impressive, he was afraid the male lead would cause more trouble in the future, so he specifically came here to greet everyone, hoping that all the teachers and students would be more tolerant. The male lead was speechless. The other people familiar with the male lead were also about to laugh themselves silly. His father and mother were so ashamed they almost wanted to dig a hole and hide in it. Next was course selection. The male lead decisively chose magic and combat, those courses related to adventure. Taimei chose internal affairs. Of course, this was all for the future, so she could manage the territory with the male lead. Jeannie, however, chose business courses to help the male lead with business and make money. The male lead was very happy. With the help of these two capable wives, he could also rest assured to go on adventures in the future. When he left the classroom after choosing his courses, the male lead saw the previous two-armed trio bullying a cat-eared girl. Taking a closer look, he realized the cat girl was his friend. The male lead immediately walked over. The three of them saw it was the male lead. They were also terribly scared, but they were also very curious. As a noble, why wouldn't he help the nobles? Instead, he chose to help a commoner. Little Fatty was instantly angered. He wants his father to destroy that civilian's home. The male lead is about to explode. The two princesses interrupt them. This scares the three of them. After all, they can't compare to the two princesses in a fight. They're no match for them. They immediately kneel down and beg frantically for mercy. The princesses don't bother to respond to them. The cat-eared girl also quickly thanked the male lead. The male lead generously replied that she could come to him for help if she ever encountered any difficulties. Seeing how close the two were, the two princesses couldn't stand it anymore and decided to have a good talk with the cat-eared girl. Of course, the male lead had to kneel aside and listen. However, what the male lead didn't expect was that the three of them actually hit it off quite well. It seemed like they had even formed a secret alliance. At this moment, a burst of laughter suddenly rang in the male lead's ears. It was the voice of the teacher assigned to him by the 7 gods. It was a telepathic message sent over a long distance. The male lead then followed the sound of the voice and arrived at the school library. But unexpectedly, after opening the door, what met his eyes was a house. Then the male lead was transported into the house by magic. This kid is amazing, because in his previous life, he died while acting bravely. Upon reincarnation, he received the full-level blessings of 7 gods. A casual fireball spell is powerful enough to destroy an entire island. But the gods still think he's not powerful enough, because the world's evil god is about to awaken again. So the protagonist still needs to become stronger. So they found a master for him. And this master is also a reincarnated being. He is the evil god that he defeated and sealed 300 years ago. But now he has also become a god. He created his own world. Like other gods, he is now equally unable to interfere in human affairs. So the task of saving the world can only be left to the male protagonist. And this is also related to the male protagonist's past life. Before the male protagonist could ask, he was taken to the sea by his master. Before the male lead could react, his master threw him another sword, and told him that if he wanted to know the reason why he first had to complete his training task, the task was to cross this forest and return to his mansion. Because the male lead's strength in this world was only considered average at best, he needed to raise his level to over 600. Only then is there a chance of defeating the evil god. Although this will take a considerable amount of time, the master told the male lead to rest assured, because the flow of time in the two worlds is different. A year here is only equivalent to a single day in the male lead's world. After saying this, the master immediately teleported back. The male lead was also helpless. He had no choice but to brace himself and charge into the forest. It was time to start hunting monsters and leveling up. And the monsters in this forest were no ordinary ones. The protagonist had only been in for 2.5 minutes when he was attacked by dozens of monsters. But this was exactly what he wanted. He charged straight at the monsters and began a bloody slaughter. In another world, although the male lead only disappeared for a day, the two princesses were extremely worried. They went straight to the male lead's house. Hearing that he hadn't returned since last night, Jeannie thought he had been kidnapped. But Taimei reassured her, saying that with the male lead's capabilities, who could possibly kidnap him? So she decided to wait for him at home. The male protagonist has been fighting non-stop for an entire year. He has completely exhausted over 100 million units of magic power. After taking down the last monster in front of him, the male protagonist falls into despair. Because for the past year, he hasn't had much sleep. Now, he doesn't even have the strength to think. At this moment, he suddenly hears a scream. Instinctively, he stands up. He walked in the direction of the sound. After arriving at the location, the protagonist found an injured young wolf. Seeing its severe injuries, the protagonist picked up his sword, intending to end its suffering. But in the next moment, he suddenly regained his senses. At the same time, he realized that the killings this year had caused him to lose his original kindness. Remembering his goal was to protect others, the male lead began to treat the little wolf's wounds. Although his magic was depleted, he managed to squeeze out a little more. After forcefully squeezing out a bit of magic to heal the little wolf's wounds, the male lead fainted. And the little wolf, because he had been saved by the male lead, remained by his side, guarding him. After the male lead woke up, he was deeply moved by the little wolf's actions. So he took it as a pet and named it Xiaobai. In the time that followed, he and Xiaobai shared meals and slept together at night. During the day, he and Xiaobai fought monsters and traveled together. 2.5 years quickly passed. The male lead finally returned to his master's mansion, and his appearance was no longer that of a child. His master immediately recognized the being accompanying him. It was Fenrir, the wolf god. The male lead never imagined that Xiaobai was such an incredible divine beast. Then, under his master's guidance, the male lead successfully formed a contract with Xiaobai. He could now summon and dismiss it at will. The male protagonist's training doesn't end here. His next training task is to defeat a strong man named Dolan. Although the male protagonist is much stronger than before, he still isn't a match for Dolan. With just one move, Dolan knocks him unconscious. Meanwhile, the two princesses, who have been waiting for 2.5 days, are making cookies, her boyfriend's favorite, to cheer him up when he returns. They are being taught by the maid how to make them. Meanwhile, in another world, he has been training with Dolan for 2.5 months. Now he can barely manage to parry a few of Dolan's moves. Dolan is very pleased with his progress. After all, when the training first began, the male lead couldn't even manage to walk home. 2.5 years passed quickly. That day, while battling Dolan, he finally managed to defeat him. Dolan happily declared that his training was over. As promised, his master told him about his origins and the evil god. It turned out that this world originally had 8 gods. The world the male lead is in lacks entertainment because it lacks the god of games, and he is now the evil god. Because of his momentary indulgence in play, he actually sparked wars all over the world. So he was banished from the divine realm as the evil god. Master was trying to seal the evil god. He was just summoned by the gods. And at the same time, the protagonist's parents were also summoned. 300 years ago, in a battle against the evil god, the 3 of them worked together and successfully sealed the evil god away. But the protagonist's parents unfortunately died in that battle. After learning of his parents' deaths, the protagonist finally understood that his parents hadn't abandoned him. They had come to this world. The master also told him that his parents had always been worried about him. Since he came to this world, he had been constantly searching for a way to return to his original world. Hearing this, the male protagonist finally broke down. He knelt before his parents' graves and wept, and he swore that he would definitely defeat that damned evil god and avenge his parents. After thanking his master, the main character prepared to return to his own world. At this time, his master called out to him, because his appearance would surely arouse suspicion if he went back like that. So he transformed the main character back into a child's form. And Dolan, before leaving, gave his pet to the main character. After thanking them both again, he was sent back. Meanwhile, a group of people in the male lead's house were anxiously waiting for him. Seeing the male lead return, the maid and the 2 princesses were overjoyed. Seeing how worried they were about him, the male lead quickly apologized to them. Then Jenny took out the cookies they had made for him. But this was only on the surface. The male lead, who disappeared for several days, naturally couldn't avoid his 2 fiancées' blame. This kid is amazing. Before even reaching adulthood, he's already become the world's strongest invincible SS-class giant dragon. He can obliterate someone with a flick of his wrist. Even a basic spell of his has the power of a nuclear bomb. They directly scared the city guards into wetting themselves. They mistakenly thought the demon lord had been resurrected, so they hurriedly sounded the alarm. They notified all the soldiers to go out and fight the demon lord. However, the main character had already left the scene using teleportation magic. When the soldiers arrived, they only saw a deep pit. That day, the main character was exceptionally promoted to an A-rank adventurer by the Adventurers Guild Master. But before that, the male lead needs to complete a task of dealing with thieves. This is naturally a piece of cake for him. After being teleported to the forest, he stopped pretending. He immediately activated his flying cheat mode. It didn't take long for him to find a group of thieves robbing people with knives. So, the male lead decisively chose to step in and help. However, what he didn't expect was that the people who were robbed were his 2 teachers from his early childhood. Seeing that Jeannie was injured, the male protagonist hurried over and used healing magic. Seeing that the male protagonist was just a little kid, the thieves mocked him and told him to go home and drink milk. Of course, the male protagonist couldn't stand for this. He charged straight at them with his sword and fought. Because the mission required capturing them alive, the male protagonist didn't use lethal force. He only knocked them out. After the 2 teachers learned that the male protagonist was on a mission, they were also shocked. After all, only B-rank adventurers can accept missions like exterminating bandits. So the male protagonist took out his A-class card. This surprised the 2 teachers even more. They hadn't expected the male protagonist to be only 12 years old and already be an A-class adventurer. However, thinking that the male protagonist grew up normally, the 2 teachers were relieved. Then, the group took the thief back to the city. The merchant the male lead saved was Paloma's father. When Paloma thanked the male lead, she accidentally revealed his identity as a baron. The 2 teachers were startled again and immediately wanted to change their address to Sir. But the male lead told them not to worry, to just call him as they usually did. Seeing how approachable the male lead was, the teacher couldn't help but praise him for maturing so much. She immediately gave him a loving hug. This almost suffocated the male lead on the spot. Because he still had to go to the guild to turn in his quest, the male lead quickly drove his carriage away. The 2 teachers, of course, wouldn't let this golden son-in-law go. They immediately chased after him. After arriving at the Adventurers Guild, the older sister saw that the male lead had completed the task so quickly, and exclaimed, "Wow, that's amazing." After all, only 2.5 hours had passed since he accepted the task. At this time, the 2 teachers waiting nearby were suddenly harassed by 3 thugs. Seeing that the 2 women ignored them, the thugs decided to resort to force. At that moment, the male lead stopped him. The thug, who had been so arrogant, upon seeing the male lead's face, immediately did a complete 180. Then the red-haired man came over. The male lead quickly stepped forward and greeted him. But what he didn't expect was that the red-haired man was actually Lee's brother. Seeing someone familiar, even Redhead couldn't help but exclaim how small the world is. So he suggested they have a drink to celebrate. Of course, the main character drank juice. After a few drinks, the two teachers took out the storage bags the main character had made for them and showed them off. When Redhead's wife learned about their bags and found out that it could even fit a castle inside, taking advantage of his drunkenness, she started acting cute to the male lead. So the male lead had no choice but to agree to make one for her too. The blue-haired one just wanted to hug and cuddle the male lead, but he fell asleep directly. And the red-haired one wasn't angry. After all, in his eyes, the male lead was still a child. The next day, the male protagonist is in magic class. Because the male protagonist is just too amazing, the school's defensive barrier can't even withstand his basic magic. So the teacher directly banned him. He is prohibited from using magic at school. As for the issue of credits, the teacher just gave him a perfect score. Seeing the male protagonist being isolated outside, the four who had been secretly watching also decided to help him. So, during the adventure class, they directly signed up to be the instructors. And their goal was to let the classmates know how awesome the male lead was, thus making him popular with his classmates. Because everyone who chose the adventure class had joined the Adventurers Guild, the redhead asked them to show their cards. He wanted the main character to show his gold card to show off in front of his classmates. The main character was almost in tears. After all, his classmates had only just joined the Adventurers Guild. If he showed his gold card now, his classmates would be scared to death. So the main character had to lie and say he'd forgotten it. Seeing this, Red-haired had no choice but to give up. They decided to move on to the next step of their plan. The plan was to, during the practical class, deliberately place the male lead last. They would then show off their skills to the other students. Then, they'd let the male lead make his grand entrance. This way, everyone else would be intimidated by his strength, and he would become the hero of the class. After the redhead had thoroughly defeated the whole class, it was finally the male protagonist's turn. However, just as he was eager to give it a try, the school bell rang suddenly. Thus, the male protagonist's anticipated battle was forced to end. And such an opportunity would never come again. Because the school's funds were all used to repair the school grounds he had damaged. So there was no budget at all to invite adventurers to come and give a lecture. The male protagonist was nearly in tears, but the red-haired culprit seemed completely unconcerned. That night, the male protagonist took all his anger towards the red-haired man and vented it on the monsters. At that moment, the father suddenly noticed the male protagonist's handkerchief. He immediately understood who the so-called person was. However, he didn't dare to make this matter public. The next day, news of the Demon King's resurrection reached the king's ears. So, he asked the male protagonist, the apostle of the gods, if he had received any divine revelation. The male protagonist didn't know how to explain. He couldn't exactly say that the Demon King he spoke of was himself. The king sensed the male lead was hiding something. So, under his questioning, the male lead could only admit that he had destroyed the forest. However, unknown to them, after the male lead's rampage, the Demon King was resurrected. This kid is amazing. While his peers were still using summoning magic to summon small cats, dogs, and mice, the protagonist's summoning circle unleashed powerful energy that almost demolished the school. Seeing something was wrong, the teacher hurriedly told him to stop, but it was clearly too late. And what he summoned wasn't a monster, but the demon lord of this world. Even the demon lord looked dumbfounded. He couldn't understand how a mere human managed to summon him here. The male lead, hearing that the other party was actually a demon lord, quickly used a flashbang to blind his classmates and teacher. If they knew he'd summoned a demon lord, they'd probably wet their pants in fright. The demon lord then used an appraisal skill on the male lead. After seeing the male lead's attributes clearly, the Demon King immediately knelt down before him. While begging the male lead not to kill him, he also expressed his willingness to sign a summoning contract with him. And as long as the male lead agrees, even if it means destroying this country, he would use all the demon forces at his disposal to carry it out. The male lead was speechless. Although he had no intention of destroying the country, he still made a pact with the Demon King. After the Demon King pledged loyalty to the protagonist, he returned to the demon realm. At that moment, the teacher called out to the protagonist. Because the teacher had just seen the protagonist summon someone, and that person seemed to claim they were the Demon King. The protagonist quickly tried to make an excuse. He said the other party was just a small fry from the demon race, and he hadn't been able to sign a contract with them either. Hearing this, the teacher could only reluctantly choose to believe him. However, just as the male lead was relieved at having gotten away with it, the teacher told the king about it. So, under the king's questioning, the male lead could only admit the truth. Although the king was shocked, he was more filled with lingering fear. After all, the other party is the Demon King. If the Demon King decided to act on the spot, destroying the capital would be a matter of minutes. In response, the protagonist could only keep apologizing, because he never expected to summon something like this. At this point, the teacher couldn't help but wonder how much magic the protagonist had. Only then can one summon such a terrifying existence as the Demon King. The same is true for the king. He is curious how strong the male lead's attributes are after training with the first king. Just how incredibly powerful are they? So, after asking his teacher to keep what he was about to see a secret, the male lead opened his attribute panel. Incredible. Now the Duke and the Chancellor dare not address the male lead by his given name. They hastily changed their address to Your Highness. The king also fears that the male lead, if displeased, might destroy the country. After all, with his current abilities, even destroying the world wouldn't be a problem. So the king immediately wanted to cede his throne to the male lead. The male lead was truly amazed. He decisively refused the king's offer. Just let them treat him the same way as usual. The king could only helplessly agree. Then, in order to keep the male lead, the king directly promoted him to a viscount. He allowed the male lead to choose any town near the capital as his territory. The king also planned to announce his engagement to the princess ahead of time. After saying this, without waiting for the male lead to agree, he turned around and started making preparations. The maid was overjoyed when she heard that her master had been promoted. She was extremely excited. However, just as she was congratulating him, the butler delivered some bad news. It turned out that the number of monsters in the forest near his master's ancestral home had suddenly increased dramatically, and they had also become much more ferocious. This was a clear sign of a monster infestation. At this rate, they'll soon break out of the forest and attack the towns. So the male lead teleports directly to the Adventurers Guild to gather some information. The receptionist tells him that the situation is dire. Ordinary adventurers now find it difficult even to approach the forest. Many have been injured because of this. At that moment, the protagonist's two teachers called out to him. The two of them were sent here to reinforce because of the shortage of manpower. Upon learning that more adventurers were being sent here, the protagonist felt relieved. Then he teleported directly into the forest, summoned two magical pets, and began exploring the depths of the forest. But the male protagonist always has the feeling of being watched on the road. At first, he thought it was the monsters around him staring at him, but after killing them all, the feeling still didn't disappear. So, the male protagonist summoned the Demon King again, hoping he could help investigate. Being summoned twice in a row, the Demon King couldn't help but lose his temper. But after seeing that it was the male lead, the Demon King's temper instantly vanished. Upon learning that the male lead summoned him, the Demon King also sensed a powerful aura, and there were countless high-level monsters lurking around him. But the male lead still wanted more detailed information, so the Demon King summoned another subordinate skilled in reconnaissance. The old man truly lives up to his reputation as an expert in reconnaissance. He was just summoned here, and he immediately sensed the male protagonist. Upon hearing that the male protagonist is actually an apostle of God, the old man hurriedly bowed deeply to show his respect. Then, not daring to slack off, he quickly used his abilities to begin the reconnaissance. As the bats scattered in all directions, one by one, the monsters emerged. Seeing this, the male protagonist charged forward, cutting them down one by one. In a flash, he had eliminated them all. Although the old man knew the male protagonist was powerful, but after witnessing it firsthand, he was still shocked by his strength. After killing the monsters, the male protagonist also decided to go back and report the situation. After saying that, he teleported back directly. The old man could only be thankful that he wasn't the protagonist's enemy. Otherwise, even if he had 10 lives, it wouldn't be enough for the protagonist to kill him. As for the others, seeing the pile of corpses the protagonist brought back, they were also shocked. After all, these were all S-class monsters. Upon learning that the forest is now full of monsters of this level, everyone's expressions instantly turned serious. Meanwhile, the old man also led the demon lord deep into the forest and found the location of that powerful aura. And the owner of this aura was the evil god. They see his hiding place discovered, but his own strength hasn't fully recovered yet. So he had no choice but to prematurely trigger the monster outbreak to buy some time. The Demon King also quickly teleported to the city. He told the male protagonist about this. So the male protagonist had no choice but to leave Red Hair and the others here to defend the city. He and the Demon King went to the forest to defeat the evil god. However, just as the two were about to leave the city, the Knight Commander also arrived. Because they hadn't seen each other for a long time, the commander missed the male lead so much she was nearly going crazy. And the reason she rushed here was because the knights received a request for help from the male lead's father. She arrived here first. After learning that the male lead planned to go to the forest, the commander also intended to go with him. But the male lead asked her to stay behind and command the knights, and protect his family. The squadron leader readily agreed. After all, the protagonist's family is her family. Meanwhile, the old man left alone in the forest was incredibly formidable. Although monsters constantly appeared around him, none could get close to him. After all, he was once one of the 4 heavenly kings of the Demon King's army. Even though he is retired now, his skills are still intact. The male lead and the Demon King also arrived at this time. This kid is amazing. Any of his spells could destroy the world. Even the most amazing creatures couldn't withstand a single attack from him. He could even shoot a hole through the earth. Even the Demon King is willing to become his subordinate. However, there is still an evil god even more wicked than the Demon King. The entire world has fallen into crisis because of the evil god. Seeing that monsters are now flooding the world because of him, and there's no way to kill them all, the protagonist decides to capture the leader first. He'll go eliminate the evil god first, prevent this crisis from the root, while the demon lord stayed behind to eliminate these minor monsters. Then the demon lord summoned the 4 heavenly kings. They originally thought the demon lord summoned them to destroy the world, but unexpectedly, the demon lord instead asked them to save the world, and it was a request from someone else. However, after hearing that the male protagonist was a messenger of God, they were speechless. They had no choice but to agree to the demon lord. They followed him and started eliminating the small monsters. Meanwhile, the male lead was also eliminating small monsters while rushing towards the evil god's hideout. A tornado destroyed the parking lot. Then, a breath attack suddenly shot out from the flames. The male lead quickly blocked it with a fireball. The one who attacked was the evil god. The evil god was also extremely angry because he hadn't fully regained his power. He could only borrow the body of the black dragon. After speaking, he shot out a group of minions. He wanted to speed up the process of destroying the world. The protagonist intended to persuade him to give up his slaughter and turn back to the right path. But clearly, he was thinking wishfully. Otherwise, how would the evil god be called the evil god? At the same time, despite the Demon King and the others doing their best to stop them, many monsters still escaped the forest. Fortunately, the red-haired quartet arrived just in time, successfully intercepting these escaped monsters. Meanwhile, the battle on the protagonist's side had already begun. This time, the evil god wasn't summoning small monsters, but used a petrifying breath. Seeing this, the protagonist didn't dare to take it head-on. After dodging the breath, he raised his hand and summoned a tornado to destroy the parking lot of the evil god. Then he returned it. Although this is already the highest level magic that an ordinary person can learn, but with only this level of magic, it clearly wouldn't cause much damage to the evil god. The male protagonist originally wanted to use a higher level emperor-class magic, but because he needs to charge up his power, the evil god simply wouldn't give him the chance. The male lead could only create distance between himself and the evil god. But he, a 3-legged human, how could he possibly outrun a dragon with 2 wings? So the male lead summoned 2 divine pets, hoping they would buy him some time. But in terms of size, 2 pets are no match for the evil god. With a mighty dragon tail sweep, the evil god knocked Xiao Bai unconscious. Just as the evil god was about to deliver the final blow, Xiaoyin rushed in and took the fatal blow for Xiao Bai. As the saying goes, sacrificing a teammate grants boundless power. The male protagonist thus unleashed his full potential. After saving his 2 pets, the male lead begins his scion transformation. However, the evil spirit was divided long ago. The male lead is still continuing to attack. The 2 pets quickly bite his pant leg, urging him to stop the attack. Just as the male lead is puzzled, the Demon King runs over. After all, if they don't stop him, the entire planet is probably doomed. As for the evil god, it was already destroyed by the protagonist, leaving not even a trace behind. And after its death, the monsters returned to the forest. In other words, the protagonist successfully saved the world. But the king knows nothing of all this. Although the royal capital is thousands of miles away from the forest, he saw that beam of light last night. The people of the capital also thought it was a god descending. He knew that only one person could do something like this, and that was the male lead. So the king began to send troops to punish him. Upon learning that it was the male lead who used the emperor-level magic, the king became even angrier. However, upon learning that the male lead did it to save the world, the king was relieved. So, the king had no choice but to promote the male lead and grant him a title. He also rewarded him with a piece of land of his own. This was meant to be a reward for saving the world. At the same time, the king officially announced his engagement to the two princesses and the leader. However, when the male lead arrived at his new territory, he realized that he had been tricked by the king. It turns out this territory is already under the control of the Adventurers Guild, but that's nothing to the male lead. Take this. Just like that, the male lead quickly seized control of the territory. That day, the male lead was enjoying afternoon tea with two princesses when the Demon King suddenly showed up. Before he could explain himself, the Demon King's wife also arrived. It turned out the Demon King had been caught cheating. Seeing the two princesses present, the male protagonist didn't dare say anything. But the two princesses couldn't stand it anymore. The Demon King's wife agreed with the princesses. After warning the male lead not to cheat like a Demon King, she took the Demon King back for severe punishment. Then the male lead used magic to build a house in his territory.